If you've been around long enough, you might remember my dad telling this story, but I get right to it since I'm his son. He recalls one time walking into a sanctuary, and as he was walking to his spot, passing some of the pews, and in one of the pews was a mother with a couple of her unruly children. And the kids were giggling and poking each other, and then eventually they started devolving into hitting each other and messing around, all in good fun. And as my dad passed their pew, he could hear the mother lean over and say in a harsh whisper, "Stop smiling. This is church." Stop smiling. This is church. I wonder if you've ever thought about church with that kind of attitude. I wonder if you've ever thought about showing up as a passive drone, as somebody who is not allowed to embrace or show any emotion in this space, to merely be distant, disconnected, and to receive what is told of you, to behave in a certain way. For the 4 Sundays in February, we're going to be talking about this God that has come to us in the manger of Bethlehem. What is God? Who is God? Really, what is God really like, and who is this God? Because the incarnation, the great mystery that we praise and lie in awe of, is this: that Jesus is the full revelation of the God who made us, who sustains us, and who promises to redeem us. That there is no difference between Jesus and God. What we see in Jesus, you might say, is what you get with God. And yet so often in the living out and the practicing of our faith, I think we separate the two. We think that God is wearing this Jesus mask, and someday the mask is going to come off, and we're going to get a God that we really are afraid of, a God we really don't want to meet or be in relationship with. And so for 4 Sundays, beginning today, we're going to talk about this God that's revealed in Jesus Christ. We're starting at the very beginning of John's gospel this Sunday, which I think is a fascinating way to start the story of Jesus. The evangelist John has chosen not to begin with a great sermon that Jesus gives, like in the Gospel of Luke. He doesn't begin Jesus' ministry with a healing of a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath, like Mark does. He doesn't even begin with the temptation story. Instead, John pictures the beginning of Jesus' ministry happening at a wedding celebration. And the dilemma, the conflict that kicks off the gospel is this: the party has run out of wine. The celebration is quickly falling apart and coming to a halt. Fascinating way just to stop and think about why John might have chosen this story to reveal to us this God in skin and bone, Jesus Christ. Now, this morning, I want to tackle, or at least address, an idea that's been passed down throughout Christian history that we might misuse and misunderstand. And if we're not careful, this idea can lead us into dangerous and unhelpful ideas about who God is. This idea is that God is impassible. I don't know if you've ever heard of this word, but it's been around for thousands of years as the people of God have talked about God. Impassibility is what they say. Impassible just means this: that God is not affected, God doesn't feel pain nor pleasure because of our actions as creatures. God is not changed by what we might do to God. Now, the word in Greek is apatheos, without pathos. It's where we get the word apathetic. And if we're not careful, we might misunderstand what we're talking about when we come to God being impassible. See, the idea first came about in ancient Greek philosophy. I don't know if you've ever studied Aristotle, but Aristotle talks about God as the first unmoved mover, the cause of all things, who is not changed by things being set into motion. So Aristotle described this unmoved mover, but Aristotle lived in a world where gods, multiple gods, were anything but impassible, right? We hear stories all the time about the Greco-Roman religion of these gods getting mad with human beings, getting upset, getting frustrated with each other. And so they lash out and react, sometimes impulsively. And so this idea of impassibility shows up in the Christian faith partly as a response to all those gods and their impetuous attitudes. The Christians say you don't have to worry about God overreacting or responding impulsively to your behavior. This God is perfect. This God won't change based on what you do or don't do. Originally, it was kind of good news about the God who made us and whom we worship. But if we're not careful, impassibility can become apathy. Impassibility can become a God who's distant from us, disinterested in what's going on in the world and the events that are taking place all around us. If we're not careful, this view of God being distant and disinterested can make us, the people who worship God, become distant and disinterested, apathetic. So it's important for us that we look carefully at our ideas about God, because whether we know it or not, they are shaping us as people who are made in God's image. Now, this story of Jesus at the wedding in Cana of Galilee is interesting to me because at first, it looks like Jesus is not interested in what's going on in the party, right? The mother of Jesus, Mary is what we call her. Mary comes to her son and says, "Hey, Jesus, they've run out of wine." She alerts him to the fact that there's a problem here. And what is Jesus' response? "Woman, what is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." At first glance, it looks like we have a God revealed in Jesus Christ who's not concerned, who's not involved with what's going on in the world around him. Now, this is a little scary. I know that this is first world problems, we might say, running out of wine at a wedding reception. But we can extract the small things and apply them to bigger things, can we not? If Jesus is literally there at the wedding reception and he doesn't seem to care what's happening to the bridegroom and the bridal party, well, then could we begin to think that Jesus doesn't care about other things going on in the world? Right? Eventually, we can start to worry and wonder whether God shows up and is paying attention to what's happening on a larger scale. Things like people suffering in poverty. Things like unexpected illnesses striking us and our loved ones. Things like environmental issues all around us and the world changing through war and conflict. Does God care about any of it? We might fear at the very beginning of John 2 that the answer is no. God's disinterested and distant. Mary is the key figure here in this story. You see, Mary goes directly to Jesus when she hears that there's an issue with the wine. She knows who to go to, and she knows that her son will care. You see, Mary knows Jesus better than anybody at this point. She literally gave birth to him and has watched him grow. She's been around him more intimately than anyone else. She knows her son. She knows what God is like because she has seen God in her son, Jesus of Nazareth. And so she goes to him, I think, knowing that he does care. In the 6th century, there was a guy who wrote hymns. His name was Romanus, the melodist. And he lived in the Byzantine Empire, and he wrote all these hymns. And he wrote a hymn where he imagines an extended dialogue taking place at the wedding of Cana. And he puts Jesus and Mary in this imaginative dialogue. And Mary goes to him and says, "Hey, they're out of wine." And Jesus says, "Well, what does it matter? It's not my time yet." And then Romanus imagines Mary saying this: "You're the one who holds all time in his hands. You have created time itself as a gift. How can you not say your hour has not yet come?" And then Romanus imagines Jesus' reply to Mary's intercession. And this is what Romanus imagines Jesus to say: "Watch and see the meaning of this delay. I was waiting for somebody else to notice. I was wanting someone else to see." I love that. That God has made space for Mary or anybody to also care about what's going on. Far from being disinterested, far from being distant, the God we worship, the God who is revealed in Jesus, invites us to also pay attention, to also be personally invested. And so what we see in Mary is someone who trusts that God will act, but nevertheless goes to God and intercedes for the people who are on the brink of shame. She jumps in and calls God to action. The late rabbi of the Orthodox synagogues in Great Britain, Jonathan Sacks, talks about how Judaism is not a religion of acceptance, but a religion of protest. And I think what we see here in Mary is the very same idea. Now, Mary's not going to merely accept the state of things, but sees her call as one to go and protest things as they are so that they can be different. So she goes to Jesus. She gets this reply, "My hour has not yet come." But then what is her response? She goes to the servants and says, probably with a smile on her face, "Do whatever he tells you." She knows. She knows the God who is revealed in her Son. She trusts that God will do something. Nevertheless, she intercedes. Nevertheless, she gets involved. What is this telling us? What is this story trying to teach us this morning? Well, I think one thing is this, that God is lively, God is dynamic, God is personally involved in what's happening in the world, both on the large scale and the small. But God's liveliness shows up in us. God's liveliness enlivens our own responses to what's happening in the world. God is responsible to what is going on in creation, yet God invites us as God's people to take responsibility for others. Easy to say, not easy to do. God invites us to take responsibility for our neighbors and their welfare. When they seem to be on the brink of shame, God calls us to intercede so that they might instead be celebrated. Because a God who doesn't feel, a God who's distant and disinterested, is not a God who truly loves. I love what the 20th century German theologian Jürgen Moltmann says about this. He says, a God who cannot suffer, a God who's apatheos, who's impassible, is a God who is poorer than any person. A God who is incapable of suffering is a being who cannot be involved. This God cannot be shaken by anything, but this God cannot love. Moltmann says that our view of God as an unmoved mover is really a God who is a loveless beloved. A God who cannot suffer is a God who cannot love. God indeed loves, but the way that God loves is by extending that love through us, God's people. If you've ever come across the medieval mystic Teresa of Avila, then you might know this quote from her. This is what Teresa says: "Christ has no body but yours, no hands or feet but yours. Yours are the eyes with which Christ looks with compassion on the world. Yours are the feet with which Christ walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Christ has no body but yours." Friends, the truth of the matter is that God's liveliness does enliven us. And as we stick close to Jesus, we allow that life of God to work in us, that we might come alive for the sake of our neighbors. Mary sticks close to Jesus, and so she knows how God will respond. She trusts that God will get involved. And indeed, God does get involved, right? Changes 6 of these massive jars into somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons of wine. An irresponsible action for people who are already probably overserved. Friends, I know we get weird about alcohol, but the alcohol's not the point of the story. Indeed, Chris Estes, who's the pastor of Recovery Ministries here, I asked him about this, and he pointed me to a quote from the Big Book that I thought was really helpful. This is what the Big Book says: "For most folks, drinking really means conviviality. It means companionship, and it means a joyous intimacy with friends." Jesus keeps the party going, not just so that people can have more, but so that they can be together longer. The wine is merely a means to the end that we are presented with in Isaiah. Did you hear that text earlier? "On this mountain, I will make a feast of rich foods, of well-aged wines strained clear." Jesus is inaugurating a new beginning. Jesus is bringing something new: conviviality, companionship, a joyous intimacy together with God and with each other. God does take responsibility only to keep the celebration going. And friends, that's our calling too. As those who serve as hands and feet of Christ in the world, we take responsibility for others so that they may know celebration, not shame, so that they might be blessed, not cursed, so that they might experience grace and not retribution. God's people take responsibility, even for those who may not love them in return. For that is the God we worship, the God we really believed is revealed in Jesus Christ. We stick close to Jesus, friends, to learn this. And so we celebrate communion as a place where we come into God's presence, where that grace, that liveliness is taken into our own lives. We believe that as we eat and we drink at this feast that never ends, we are pointing, this is a sign to what God is already doing and what God one day will accomplish throughout creation. That feast where the shroud of death is removed, where every tear is dried, where God will be all in all. Sounds like a good time. Sounds like a party.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.